two, one. Welcome back, everyone. Rabbi Conspiro, welcome back.
Always good to be back.
Okay, so we're wandering a little bit into the thicket today of what is happening on campus and worldwide. And one of the ideas that you brought up is what's the real battle that we're in here? What is the war that we're fighting actually? I think we are hyper focused right now on Israel has just gone into Gaza, what's happening on campus in North America. But what are the real stakes of what's going on, and how do we contextualize that so we can keep our eye on the prize, so to speak? Like, are we looking at the right thing? Are we talking about the right things? I often have students reach out to me saying, what should I be doing? Like, should I go to every protest? Should I be arguing with people online? Should I be, focusing on one thing and not the other thing? How do I know what to deal with? So I think we're trying to find a bit of context to understand what is the actual conflict that we're in today.
Right. So that's really important point because I think especially with Israelis and Israel, we're very narrowly focused on releasing hostages, defeating an
Hmm.
enemy who's right down the street from us. Like the front
Yeah.
line is next door. It's not like again fighting in Vietnam thousands of miles away. So this is an existential threat. And it's kind of like when you're suffering from an existential threat, you don't have time to pull back and focus on anything else. The enemy's at the gates, so to speak. But I think that's also happening with we've been really wrong-footed. The Jews, like on campuses and students, we got really gut punched on October 7th. And then, boom, immediately the other side swung into action with very aggressively, and very well organized, which is a whole nother discussion we need to have too about what's going on here. This is just too well planned. But one of the
Yeah.
things that the people are people just use terminology they don't even understand, like jihad and intifada, which is pretty violent, uprising idea. But they're talking about globalize the intifada. What we need to do is we need to step back collectively, the Jewish people and the world, because when as we expand on this topic, I think that'll become very clear why the world needs to do this also. We need to globalize what's going on here now, because what is going on is something that is very global. Israel might be sort of be the match that lights the tinder that and it might be the front line that the spear is poking into is the Jewish people and the Jewish state.
Hmm.
But what is really going on here on a deeper level is a much bigger struggle. It's really civilizational clash. And the reason why it's hard to see is that one group of people involved in attacking us and Western civilization, which is the radical Islamic world, is kind of using as their foil, uh, like a lot of well-intended but poorly educated, not necessarily stupid, because you have a high intelligence and still be very stupid,
Right.
but like young, idealistic, mostly middle class and upper middle class students who are being completely gaslighted, like about what's really going on, and because they're in the front line screaming, people are not necessarily focusing on what's going on, which is kind of a combination of really two things that have to be dealt with separately. And one you can sort of deal with a little more easily than the other. One is the radical Islamic ideology,
Hmm.
which is really very much involved in this, which is a global expansionist worldview that you can't talk about Islam today. And again, we're not saying that all Muslims believe in this, not at all. Most Muslims are not doing this. That's not the issue. But this is an ideology which has largely been at the forefront of Islam since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And it is not just coming out of Iran. It's not just a radical idea. It is part of what is the mainstream Islamic worldview of the concept of jihad, of their deterministic worldview, of Islam ultimately ruling the world. This is a mainstream Islamic idea, and this is
Hmm.
certainly being carried forward and they're making use of a lot of poorly educated, but very young, idealistic, especially university students, to kind of push them into the front by hiding what this by hiding what the struggle is really about because they're not screaming. It's really kind of scary that they're actually. I'm waiting for the students to start screaming about jihad. They're already screaming about intifada. So I'm waiting for
Right.
that to happen next.
Well,
But
we
that's
we
one thing.
already know they're hanging up signs and projecting things on the walls saying glory to our martyrs. So I think
Right.
that's really about a sneeze away. So I don't think it's that far. And I think actually I just wanted to throw in, for people that I know that are working in different universities, certainly the universities that are often not Ivy League, where kids are going to university in order to get a job, to learn practical skills in order to work. They're seeing far less of these protests because the kids aren't in an environment where they're just ideologues. They don't really care if their degree gets them a job. They're there to think about things and play with ideas. And whereas some of the universities that are built around you're coming here so you can have a career and get a job and move on are not seeing the same types of ideological protests that are so off base, which I think is really interesting. So this is very much a war of people who live in the world of ideas.
Absolutely. And ironically, you're seeing that the Ivy League schools, the hardest schools to get into America, which of course are focused on, as you rightly point out, a lot of liberal arts kind of stuff, which most of it is even applicable for any employment. You have to go through
Right.
amassing a massive debt to go through like $400,000 or close to that of Ivy League school debt, and then you can go off to medical school or law school or business school. And but so it's kind of like it's almost part and parcel of what you have to do in these schools to find a cause to involve yourself in, to give yourself a sense of meaning and some sense that you're making a difference in the world, even if it's the wrong cause and you're not making any difference.
Yeah,
But
I actually read a bunch of really interesting posts, just sort of interrupt, but I thought this was really important
yeah,
if we're going to talk about the student protests, which is, been a question going around. Are students always right? There's this idea that students on campus are always fighting on the right side of history, and they're not. We have examples of all of the white students that protested ending segregation in schools. We have examples of the Nazi youth, protesting in the streets, not letting Jews into schools. We have, protests that were run by the people who were supporting, um, the Iranian overthrow of the Shah. So students are not always on the right side of history. Just because they're young and energetic doesn't mean they always have the values and are supporting the ideas that are going to be the best in the long run. I think that's just something that people in the back of their consciousness, they think of things like the Vietnam War and Kent State, and they're like, oh, if students are saying this, it must be actually the right thing to do. And that's just not accurate.
yeah, you're 100% right. First of all, young and idealistic doesn't mean that have any common sense or are living in reality. That's why people they
Right.
tend to become more conservative as they get older because reality hits. It's not a luxury.
Right.
I got to make a living. I got to live. And they also see what works and what doesn't work. And they also see that it's funny that the things, that you wanted to do when you were younger, you don't want your kids to do when you get older because you see that
Right.
they're actually not so good for you. So
Right.
but the scariest part of all this now, this is the newest permutation of something that has been going on a long time. Like student movements have been going on a very long time. Young
Hmm.
and idealistic people are always the people who are most easy to manipulate, which is why totalitarian
Right.
regimes always want to control levels of, or keep people illiterate or severely control what they're allowed to have in their brains. But we now have a generation of people that actually knows almost nothing except how to access things through technology. It's sort of like you need a worldview that is based on certain values and knowledge, which is why, I'm a history guy. Why is history so important? We call it there's a great line that history is called the magistre vitae, the teacher of life. That history is what enables us, as Lord Bolingbroke said, history is philosophy teaching by examples. History is what shows us what works and doesn't work. But if you don't know any of the history,
Right.
and you just get sucked into the smart marketing of certain ideologies, which are actually proven to be failures and completely impractical and have never succeeded, you can keep selling the same thing over and over again
Right.
because you're dealing with a bunch of people who actually have no They can't contextualize what you're saying to them. They don't even know. Forget not knowing about the Arab-Israeli conflict and who was there first. They're just lacking in basic understanding of human psychology, of motivation, of how people work, of how civilizations rise and fall, of values, of things like there's so many things that are thrown into what makes a person's worldview. Understanding of relationships, of family, of sexuality, of responsibility. These are all
Right.
things, by the way, that are completely out the window today.
And I think a general moral compass, I think this idea of like, what is your rubric for right and wrong? How do you determine a moral compass? I think that that is largely something because we don't have religious education anymore, or even good philosophical conversations where people can disagree. Most people don't really, it's really their subjective opinion, or they're going to go with the majority. And we know that when people default to the majority for their moral um, rubric, we're in trouble.
Right. And that plays exactly into what I wanted to say, because on one side, you have the radical Islamists, who, by the way, Islam is a very particularistic worldview. I'm just generalizing about Muslim Islam in general, as is Judaism, by the way. We have a very specific idea of
Hmm.
what is true and what untrue, what is right and wrong, what is good and evil. Islam very much has those ideas. So they actually do not agree. They're smart enough to know how to market it. You don't want to, show people your hand. They don't agree with most of the very left wing university students. Their ideas about responsibility, sexuality, religion are antithetical completely to what the radical Islamists are into. But there's another whole set of ideology that is floating around there. It's kind of like a neo-Marxist worldview that is based on, like diversity and equity, all this kind of stuff about justice and injustice, what's fair, what's not fair. And it's not based on an objective understanding of effort versus, reward or that kind of, it's all based on the color of your skin and your sexual preference. That is the defining factor. So and what I
And,
think
and and by the way, the one that no one talks about, which is class,
yeah,
your financial security, because
exactly.
really, and this goes into something I was sharing with you, which is this idea of luxury beliefs. Like when you have enough security that you can poo-poo just about anything, without any risk to yourself, and you can just stand up, at the top of the tower telling everybody else down below what they're doing wrong. It's a very lovely position to be in, but it doesn't mean you really understand what you're talking about. And most of the time, you're not really helping the people down, quote unquote, down below.
Exactly. And ironically, these are most of the people, like you pointed out, the people who are really going to college to get a job are the people who are generally from very working class, middle class, working class families. The Ivy Leagues, which are hyper expensive, very hard to get into, and kind of self limiting into who gets into a lot of these schools. Of course, there's, scholarships for people who are gifted, but generally speaking, these are a bunch of people who are actually quite privileged themselves. And
Right.
on a certain level, are being so brainwashed, they're kind of feeling guilty. So through a form of like projection, they're projecting this onto other people because
Right.
the defining factors between like status and class are basically defined by gender and skin color. Meaning, if you are successful, that it's funny, and there's a couple of gray areas. They're like Asians who are
Right.
clearly not white people, but they're disproportionately successful because they're extremely focused. Like Indians and Asians, like Chinese, are very academically focused. They have a very strong sense
Right.
of family, by the way. They have a lot, very cohesive societies. So they kind of are the gray area for this because they don't look like the white people that all these university students who are mostly white themselves, by the way. If you look at the protests, and you have BLM involved, but there's not most of the people screaming on the campus are not black people. It's mostly white people yelling and screaming. But they have a problem with that group because it doesn't quite fit the intersectional worldview that they have of where these things fit
Right.
into, because
Right.
they're successful and they're academically overaccomplished and disproportionately represented in these schools, but they're also people. So they kind of like push that to the side. It's when it's convenient to use them, they're used. Like if an Asian is attacked by a white suprematist or something, and of course we bring it. Otherwise, we
Hmm.
discriminate against them also. Of course, the hardest people to deal with are Jews. That's the weirdest part of all of
Right.
this
We don't
because
fit.
we're the biggest minority. We're the They said I know biggest. It's like an
We're the
oxymoron. Biggest
smallest, right?
minority.
We're the
We're the
smallest
smallest. We're the
minority.
smallest. But we're of all the minorities, we're 0.2% of the world's population. I mean,
Right,
blacks in America are multiple times larger population than Jews, who are less like 2% at the most, and possibly less than that. And we are arguably the most persecuted people in human history. But since you have a bunch of mostly white liberal people who don't understand anything about the history of slavery being ubiquitous and universal and have nothing to do with skin color and no context, they view slavery as only one thing: it's white people enslaving black people. And Jews are white people, even though Jews are not white people.
right,
Some Jews are white people. I happen to be, because when my family lived in Eastern Europe, we lost our melanin. But a huge chunk of the Jewish world are as darker than as Arabs and anyone else in the Middle East, because they're Middle
right.
Eastern Jews. So it's a very kind of confused worldview, and occasionally things kind of poke out of the sides that show you that it's really not being logically consistent at all. But what we do see is that the perfect storm is, you have a bunch of people of color who come from third world, largely failed states that are failed because of they don't take, of course, they can't take responsibility. It's got to be colonialism, what's going on in Syria or Lebanon. No, they're failed because of the complete breakdown within those countries. Um, but they're now being used kind of as the point example, like it's a microtized version of a bigger conflict, which is really privileged white Western civilization
Right.
versus people either who are not white or people who are not cisgen heterosexual. Or so, but so Israel kind of fits the perfect little micro version of that, which
Right.
is miscast as a white colonial, like residual leftover that has no right to be, that it's oppressing an indigenous non-white population. So it's kind of, but what's
Eh,
interesting is you can pull back and really see why this is part of a much bigger struggle that's affecting the entire world. It's nothing to do really. It is and isn't. We get to it later, but it's really much more than anything to do with Israel and Hamas or the
And
Israelis
I,
and Palestinians.
so I really want to go into that next. So, but I just want to throw in, look, for the sake of look, Judaism is a religion of relationship and responsibility, and we have to take our responsibility for things that we have contributed to the state of affairs. And I think when we talk about this idea of seeing Jews as white, I think that the Jewish population has a part to play in that misconception with our intense focus on Ashkenazi Judaism being quote unquote the real Judaism, the marginalization, I think, of Sephardic Jews and Mena Jews in the larger Jewish sort of face of the world, and with a really, really heavy North American focus on um, the Jews that came from Europe, and where we don't talk so much about Middle Eastern Jews and that type of ancestry. We talk about the Holocaust, but we don't talk about being kicked out of Israel. You know what I mean? So it's just something that occurs to me that in some ways our own hyper focus on the Ashkenazi world being quote unquote the real Jewish world, this has kind of come around to bite us because, yeah, then the rest of the world forgets when we say, hey, wait, we're actually a Middle Eastern people. And the world is like, wait, what are you talking about? You keep telling us you're from Poland. Isn't that how you dress? So
Right.
I think there's pieces of it where we as the Jewish community have to come to terms with our own focus on that part of our history has somewhat disconnected us in the narrative from our actual homeland, which is not Europe, it is Israel. And that
Mhm.
we ourselves, I think, have to somehow reconnect that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would tweak that and say it is true, by the way, historically, if you know the history of Israel, that Israel, the Zionist movement, was over at the first Zionist conference in 1897 in Basel. There were two Sephardim there, and there were several hundred people in the room, because it's very much a European Zionism was a very much a European experience, and it is true that the early years of the state, that the our Edot Mizrach, our Middle Eastern Jewish brethren, were often generally less well educated and less successful and less cosmopolitan than Ashkenazi Jews, and definitely were abused and there were social issues. But the reality is that where the battlefield for the struggle is taking place, and I'm not talking about Gaza and Israel, I'm talking about in the cities of Western Europe primarily and the United States,
Right.
which is the white Christian kind of world. Overwhelmingly, there hasn't been the Sephardi presence in Europe ended with 1492. There's always been some Sephardic Jews in Europe, but I mean, as the center
Right.
of the Jewish world, it hasn't been around for 500 years with the expulsion of Jews from Spain. So the reality is the vast majority of Jews in the world pre-Holocaust, like 80, 85% were Ashkenazim, even though the Holocaust killed out mostly Ashkenazic Jews, 6 million Jews, the vast majority were Ashkenazi. Still, Ashkenazim are the majority. And in these European countries, it's funny because if you go to a place like France, where there is a very large Muslim population and the largest Jewish community in Europe, the majority of Jews in France are Sephardic Jews from North Africa
Right.
because these were former French colonies, like French-speaking places like Morocco and Algeria and places like that came there. So it's really not even that issue there. These are mostly Sephardic Jews versus the Muslim population of different countries. Not necessarily Arabs, by the way, but a lot of them are. So that definitely plays a role in it. But what we're but it really we're what's really going on in the United States now is so much bigger than, and this is what we really feel we're losing sight of. We don't
Right.
see that it's a struggle for a certain worldview and values, and the mistake that the world is making, mistake that we are making as Jews, and the mistake that the world is making is not seeing what's at stake here,
Yeah.
and hyper focusing on because it's like the house is on fire and you've dragged a chair outside that is burning and you're trying to extinguish that flame on the chair when the whole house is about to go up in flames.
Right. Okay. So outline for us, what's the bigger fire?
Right. So, I mean, again, there's two ideologies here that have combined in a very toxic way, even though they don't agree with each other.
Hmm.
One is the radical Islamic jihadist worldview, which, if you get, I'm sorry, if they won't, a lot of these people won't be honest with you, but occasionally they are. These are people who believe that, this is their worldview, that Muhammad is the final prophet. There's no prophets after him. Jews perverted the word of God, so God rejected them. Jews perverted the word, the Christians perverted the word of God, so God rejected them. The whole world is destined to become what's called Dar al Islam. Either become Muslim or live under Islamic rule, with people who are tolerated because they're monotheists existing as in dhimmitud, which is a second class kind of apartheid like status of being allowed to live and practice your faith,
Right.
but is discriminated against because you're not Muslims. And this whole idea of jihad, this is really what it's about. The fact that they're managing to use the people who they're attacking against the societies they're attacking, meaning using well-intended, like liberal white people who think that their system, they're tearing down the walls of their own fortresses for the enemy, is what they're doing,
Right.
because they don't understand it, because the Muslims are not telling them what they really think. Like, what are we going to do to you guys, you LGBTQ community, when we're done with everyone else? You think we're going to allow you to survive? No way. What are you going to do with you liberals? What do you think is going to happen with, free love and the sexual revolution? No way. These are not things that these societies tolerate at all. But they're
Right.
smart enough to keep their mouth shut, to pick the phrases and the words, because revolution against oppression, as opposed to like holy war against an entire like civilization and a worldview. And
Right.
that combined with that is something that's been going on for a very long time in the West. It's really been post World War II, is the infiltration, the infestation of a certain kind of Marxist left wing class war ideology that is, and it's a perfect storm because the essential understanding is of like the Marxist revolutionary model is it is about class. There's oppressed and oppressors, whether it's the communist model of the workers oppressed by the bourgeoisie and the
Hmm.
capitalists. In this case, it's the white privileged people who are have built their wealth on a system that is inherently flawed. It's based on the original sins of things like slavery and oppression
Right.
and persecution of minorities and greed, and we have to tear that system down. So here you have, think what's going on. You have a bunch of basically radical Islamist people who are viewing it from a very particularist, deterministic, religious, holy war kind of worldview. And then you have a bunch of people who are basically viewing it that we have to burn the house that we're in.
Right.
We are a bunch of privileged people who've had the best life of any human beings in the history of the planet Earth, is what a lot of these like kids on campus are screaming out. They've never known war, they've never known famine or disease or infant mortality or poverty or anything. And they're literally, because they're poorly informed, emotional, idealistic, and they want to make a difference in the world. And it's also kind of a way, it's interesting. It's also something sadistic about it or masochistic about it because they're the ones who are guilty. It's almost, like it's our society. Like we're the ones who've done this. It's mostly a bunch of white privileged people doing this to themselves. So but what is at stake? What is at stake is Western civilization
Right.
from two different angles, from a religious jihadi thing of radical Islam coming at it in one sense, which is the physical conquest, and then like the revolutionary guys who want to repeat like what happens is multiple times in history. You want what China had, you want what Russia had, you want to tear down the society. And by the way, these revolutions always eat themselves. They always consume themselves. The French Revolution, after they got rid of, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and all the bourgeoisie people they killed, they started
Right.
the guillotining thousands of their own people, and
Well,
they got murdered. This was happens in communism also. All the leaders of communism and all these Jewish revolutionaries, by the way, all ended up being
right.
murdered by Stalin.
It's also worse than that. There's a great episode of the commentary podcast recently called, where they each go, well, actually, it's worse than that, which is, and then you throw into the pepper on all of that salt is the white supremacist movement of, the Jews will not replace us. So, we're very much seeing, I mean, they're the white supremacists underground is also laughing their heads off. Great, now all of the liberal world is yelling about the Jews just like we are. So now we have the KKK, Islamic Jihad, and liberal democratic students on Ivy League campuses all saying the same things. It's such a strange convergence
Right.
of events, but it's been those three heads of anti-Semitism, right? Radical Islam, liberal left, and the white supremacist right. Those have always been the heads of the Hydra, but now they realize they're all in the same body right now.
100%. I mean, I don't really feel that the extreme right, as much as like the Democrats and Joe Biden likes to focus on, I don't really feel that they're that much of America tearing itself apart from within on university campuses is far bigger, a far greater cause of concern. I'm not saying there aren't right wing extremists out there who are dangerous, and they definitely are, but I don't view that as the primary thing as much as some
Right.
people want to like do the bait and switch, and that's the real threat. Charlottesville, what's going on in university campuses is much more scary than Charlottesville, in my opinion. What happened
Right.
there, but you do point out something that's very important, Ellie, that these groups all hate each other. I mean, these are people, if you could put them in like a triangular boxing ring, they'd just be
Right.
smashing each other in the face.
Right. Totally.
But they have, or actually, the most of the liberals wouldn't know how to fight. They were just running away and cry and like, say you're hurting me and you're violating my personal space.
Right.
But they would be, but the one thing that does unite them is that they all hate us, and they might couch it in different terminology, but more or less they're threatened by us because all three of them, and what the other thing unites them is they all represent ideologies that are false and dangerous. And some are more false and dangerous than others, but the worldviews that they're representing are, and the fact that we're in the center of it says everything about what, not about Israel and the Palestinians and not about Jewish economic control of the world and all of that stuff. It says everything on what I believe is on the deepest subconscious subliminal level about what we, the Jewish people, whether we're in the Jewish state or whether we're in Toronto or New York, whether we what we stand for collectively historically in terms of our national historic mission, whether individual Jews do it or not, it's not the issue. We're all, there's an idea, we have this idea of like Jewish spiritual DNA. We all got these Jewish souls. And on the deepest level, humanity, I think collectively is subconsciously aware that this Jewish people, they may be teeny, but boy, are they a force to reckon with. Boy, are they a force to reckon with. And you even see early anti-Semitic thinkers who, like people like Düring and Wilhelm Marr invented the word anti-Semitism. It's interesting. They talk about this. And these are Germans who are living in the late 19th century in Germany, where the Jewish community is the most focused on leaving their Judaism behind and becoming German, precisely in the society where the people are least Jewish as Jews, who love Germany more than many Germans loved. And you guy like Düring, who was one of Hitler's inspirations, talking about how Semitism, which was the term they coined to define Jews, making it sound more scientific and racial and less religious, he said that the Roman Empire in a millennia could not was nowhere near as transformative as Semitism has been in shaping humanity's conscience. So when you go to the deepest level of what the ideological struggle is about, it's kind of like, you know what it's like? I'm thinking of like a little ball inside a big space with a huge ball outside. Because the little ball is the teeny tiny 0.2% of the world that's Jewish, and the teeny tiny Jewish state that's the size of New Jersey or Costa Rica. And then the whole world is wrapped in the conflict. But the big ball around it is really this kind of holistic, universalistic struggle between the values that we brought into the world through Judaism, through one God, through ethical monotheism, that have shaped not only offshoot religions like Christianity and Islam, but have created liberal democracy, which everyone admits is founded on the Judeo-Christian ethics. But it's really the Jewish ethics, because Christianity in itself is an offshoot of Judaism. There's nothing that's said by Jesus in the Christian Bible that isn't echoing earlier words of prophets. But think about that. This is more than anything else the biggest impact that Judaism has had, as much as you could say it's had it spiritually, because Christianity and Islam would not exist without Judaism. We're the mothership, and they're we're the mother, and they're the offshoot faiths. The most transformative impact that Judaism really has had, in my opinion, is shaping modern Western liberal democracy. The notion of equality before the law, the values of life, proactive social responsibility,
Right.
of government being for the people, of the people by for the people, not a power elite of people who abuse
Right.
the masses. And think of exactly what's being attacked today, whether it's by the radically misguided Marxist revolutionary woke university students or the radical Islamists. They all have their eyes on one target. Sure, we're yelling and screaming about the Jews, but look at how they're tearing down American flags. Look at how they're talking about globalizing the Intifada. They're couching it in phrases that are very universalistic. This is a world struggle combining people, of course, don't really agree with each other, but their target is the same, which is why should be so incredibly concerning to anyone who lives in a Western liberal democracy, whether it's in France or in Holland or in England or in the United States or in Canada, because
And
we're,
where
we're
where have we
yeah.
seen those calls before? How is this familiar to us?
No, we see we if we understand, Ellie, what ultimately drives anti-Semitism, because people say, how do you know this is anti-Semitism, Israel bashing? We see very clearly, because even in the Sydney Opera House on October 7th, Israel hadn't even counterattacked yet, and they lit up the Opera House in blue and white,
Right.
support solidarity for Israel. A few hours later, the Muslims are out there calling for basically jihad against the Jews. So we
Right.
see that the huge spikes in anti-Semitism are, always connected to Israel's Gaza's war, not just what happened on October 7th. But
Right.
this is not something new. We see that throughout history, that whenever a totalitarian regime is coming to power, they always somehow feel most threatened by the Jewish people. I mean, the best example is, of course, Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler.
Hmm. Right.
The fact that he will decide in the fall of 1944, when he's basically losing the war, and he's lost Stalingrad. The Soviet army is pushing the German army back through all the territory they had won since 41, back, and eventually they get to Berlin. He has a choice of sending trains with soldiers to stop the advancing Soviet army, or forget that. Let's send 500,000 Hungarian Jews to their death in Auschwitz. Militarily, you'd call that suicide, but ideologically, if you see what Hitler writes, he says, even when we have beaten all these countries, the Jew remains our world enemy. He's a very ideologically honest, straightforward person. He recognizes that his worldview, which is diametrically opposed to Western liberal democracy, which are all the countries he's fighting and
Right.
conquering,
Right.
The ideological source, the power supply for that is ultimately the Jewish people in Judaism.
Hmm.
And therefore that always, and we see this, and you can, which is why we've always seen, Dennis Prager and Joseph Teluskin in their book, Why the Jews? I think the one that coined the phrase that Jews are the canary in the coal mine. And this is why he says anti-Semitism should
Right.
concern non-Jews, because it might
Yeah,
start with Jews.
there's a huge movement to push against that idea for various reasons. And I think the point you're making is really important, meaning like what starts with us doesn't end with us. But there's
Right.
definitely there's a push right now in the educational world to not use that phrase about the Jews anymore because it somewhat says like, you should only care about this not because Jews are killed, but because eventually they'll come for you. And so, the canary in the coal mine thing is true and at the same time problematic because we want to have people care that Jews are being killed because they're people, not just because eventually they're going to come for you. But I think this is really interesting because then it when you say Hitler Yamach Shemo recognized that the thing he was fighting against, which was liberal democratic values and the ability, a certain type of morality, which was basically wrapped up in the epitome of that is the Jewish worldview. So that's very
Absolutely.
interesting then to understand that what this globalize the intifada is actually starting to talk about is we want to eliminate this idea, all the values that come from this Judeo-Christian idea of democracy, liberalism, tolerance, the sacredness of life, that's what's really the intifada is against those ideas. It's not necessarily a call for protecting the oppressed.
Yeah, no, 100% right. And you see, talk about consuming itself. Imagine hypothetically, theoretically, God forbid, a million times that this combination of radical, students and with the jihadi Muslim, and they bring down Western governments. The next thing that's going to happen is the radical jihadi Muslims are going to go after the students and slaughter them.
Right.
Ha ha ha! They're going to be as they're being slaughtered like people were on October 7th. They're going to be going, but we were on your side. And it's not too late. It's not going to help them. But your point
Right.
is actually very interesting. I never heard that people are pushing back on that, and I hear that it shouldn't be that you should care because you got skin in the game, which is, I mean, that's something to. It is a marketing point,
Right.
but it is that we are, the way I look at it is in an army. And if you fought, I mean, I was in the army, and I know that, and anyone who reads about warfare and battles, people go to war to defend their country and their family, but when you're fighting for the soldier next to you.
Mm,
And we have to realize the way this needs to be rebranded is we're the frontline shock troops,
yeah.
but we're all protecting each other here. We're
Right.
all
We're all
soldiers
in
in
the
the same
same team.
army, in the
Yeah.
same war, and we're on the same team. And it's because of not because they're going to get me if you fall, the front line falls and the rear lines have to defend themselves, but
Right.
because of what your struggle is my struggle, and we all care about the same things. And if, by the way, it is precisely Western values that teach the
Right.
thing that you should be bothered by the people being killed. It's not just about you being threatened.
Right.
This is an idea that's not intrinsic. It's not innate in human society to value life. In an ancient
And look,
world
we
where,
see that because all these students are yelling and screaming about what's going on in Gaza, and they just don't care that there are hostages and that Israelis were killed. In fact, they're thrilled that Jews are being hurt. You know what I mean? Like, okay, like your tolerance is very narrow in terms of who you care about.
right, and that says a lot about their values and how messed up they are. So on one level, they say, no, it's like fake news. It's AI. But then they get past that and they openly admit, and by any means,
Hmm.
like you can gang rape a woman and murder her. Trust me, this is not something the average left-wing university feminist woman is going to be supporting. It's amazing what comes out of people's mouths that they don't
Right.
really think about the implications of what they're saying. But what does that go back to? Again, it's going back to exactly the point. It
Mm.
shows you how messed up people's core values are. It's kind of like thousands of years of us dragging the world kicking and screaming, often very reluctantly, towards a vision of values that comes from one God, which is the most transformative idea, not just in terms of religion, but in terms of morality and ethics, enabled Western civilization to build on that a solid foundation and a great, big, beautiful house that has empowered and given more people wealth and health and prosperity and quality of life than any other system in the world. But imagine that the foundations have been infested by termites. And that's what we see now. And it's almost as if, and it's kind of like some guy came along and dumped the termites in a jar into the foundations. And
Right.
that's sort of the way I see what's going on with the radical, Islamists. They're just the termites. They're using, just as Lenin said, the West. He got it wrong. He said the West will sell it because capitalism is so inherently flawed because it's such greed based worldview that the West will sell us the rope to hang themselves with. Because if they make a profit, I'll even commit suicide. But these forces, and by the way, it's not just the radical Muslims. We didn't even talk about who's behind all of this on the who's the power and the money. Not the Muslims are getting. They've learned a lot from the Jews. By the way, it's some very interesting interviews. They
Right.
learned a lot about us, about organizing and political activism and stuff like that. But but they also see that we can use these people that we actually despise. We despise these people more than the people they're attacking despise them. But we
Right.
can use them to do tremendous damage. And then we can move in, and once the foundations are rotted, we can knock that whole baby over. Because once you have people doubting that everything they're doing is right and they're guilty, mea culpa, like look what we've done, then we can go in and take them over, and they'll almost feel happy when we kill them because they feel so guilty about what they've done, which they didn't actually do. It's very, very scary what's going on.
Mm.
But that brings us to this interesting, yeah. You say something?
No, let's go.
No,
Let's go
no,
forward. Right, sir.
just thinking like, because the other thing that's going on is, one thing's been in the news a lot is how well organized.
Yeah, it really
You know
is
that
shocking.
the same, like even the same signs, the same slogans, the amount of equipment, and we know, and there's been a lot of discussion about this in the media because there's another and I don't like to venture into conspiracy theories and things like that. And I don't know really that much about it, but it's very clear that there's an extra territorial group of people who are kind of universalists
Hmm.
who are they use different words to describe who they are, whether they're it's corporatism is often the term I've used, that forget borders and ethnicity and race. It's a bunch of very wealthy people who are very big into whatever big businesses and technology and big pharma and whatever.
Hmm.
And it's kind of a return to a classical kind of system where an aristocracy of very wealthy, powerful people concentrated all the wealth and power in their hands and disenfranchised everyone else, which is what feudal systems were going back. Like the vast majority
Hmm.
of people in human history had no money, no power, and no
Right.
recourse for anything, and no rights really.
Right.
And you had a bunch of people. Some of them were, you can have Plato's philosopher king, the ideal of a person who's truly altruistic and idealistic and well educated, and who's a servant of the people, but he doesn't have to be democratically elected, which makes him not subject to the whims of the stupid, ignorant masses to honestly and faithfully and rightfully run a country. But that are few and far between are leaders like that because we know how much power corrupts. But there seems to be, I always say, half seriously, you want to see who's really trying to run the world? Go to the World Economic Forum in Davos. Go watch Charles Schwab speak. And it's scary the amount of arrogance that pours out of some people's mouths about how they know better than everyone else where the world's supposed to go. And they're kind of on a certain level, almost pouring lighter fluid into all of this and making it all happen for different reasons too. Because trust me, the radical Islamists don't like them either. But these are people who seem to have people like George Soros, is very involved in this, and he's a multi-billionaire person.
Right.
And different foundations and the Rockefeller Foundation, excuse me, the Rockefeller Foundation, you have certain people who are like, it's like that kind of like that thing that's on the outside of all of, it's not right in front of you, like the radical Islamists and the leftists wearing the keffiyehs and holding up the Palestinian flags.
Hmm.
It's something that's feeding it from a different place than the radical Islamic worldview because these are
Yeah,
not
and I
people.
and I think it would be really, look, with any movement, if you just follow the money, you can pretty much understand why they're saying what they're saying. It's the same with the media corporations. If you look at who's funding Fox or CNN or Star or this or that, you can get a sense of what is their opinion going to be. Well, follow the money to who funds these places, and you'll get a sense of who they're speaking for. And I think the NYPD was saying after all of the arrests that they did in Colombia that they found very tightly built strategic manuals and flyers and instructions and equipment, and that all of this is being highly organized and highly funded. Mainly, what they've been looking at, I think, is the National Students for Justice of Palestine, and who's funding that. We have no idea. There's a lot of real cloudiness in terms of where the money's coming from, and I think that's one of the things that hasn't been brought out into the open enough, which is how are these campus kids being wielded by whomever is throwing the money. And again, it's very uncomfortable as Jews to even get into this because people say conspiracy theories about Jews running the world and controlling the banks and all of those things all the time. Like, we don't want to do that too, but there's no denying that there are somebody's paying for all the tents.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And you can see how, and again, you have different groups, the useful idiots in all of these are the liberal, crazy, screaming college students. They're like just being manipulated completely. They don't understand what's going on, and they're getting it from,
Right,
in many ways, both sides. And it's kind of a perfect storm. But you can also see if you study, speaking about remembering what's next, if you study the history of how revolutions and radical change takes place,
right.
instability is always the best way. Now, there's a quote that's attributed to, I think it is Goering, Hermann Goering, the head of Luftwaffe. I don't believe he said it, but it makes 100% sense. Is when asked how Germany, in a very short period of time, which was arguably the most culturally, technologically, in many ways governmentally sophisticated country in the world, could be turned into one of the scariest totalitarian single party police states that could mechanize mass murder, and it's very very scary stuff. And he said, and again, if he said it, but it's just very obvious. He said fear. If you can
Yeah,
scare people enough, if you
yeah,
can get them riled up enough, so if you can make the boogeyman, the boogeyman is Western capitalism, and it's the system that's designed to oppress,
right.
and you can also throw into that a little idealism of now you can take those idealistic university students and you can make the world truly a better place because
Hmm.
the world's in trouble now because these evil white Western countries are poisoning the air and poisoning the oceans and oppressing people and blah, blah, blah,
Right.
blah, blah. So there's so much swirling around, but the bottom line is the world, I always say, is a rudderless ship because
Mm.
the foundations of Western civilization, there's Judeo-Christian ethics. This is idea that we mentioned brief before, but we have this idea of the cut flower ethics, which is Will Hilbert, who's an American Jewish sociologist. He talks about this, and he said this in the 1950s, and he was literally three-quarters of a century ahead of himself. He said that cut flowers, you put them in a vase, and they look nice for a week, but after because they're severed from their roots, they wither and die. He said so too with the values that make up. And he's saying this in the 1950s, our Western liberal democracy, without the life-giving nutrients they get from faith, which is basically the idea of one God, one absolute standard of morality, clarity about what is right and wrong, good and evil, truth and falsehood, when everything's falling apart, when you even can challenge biological realities, when even the most basic clear truths are now being challenged as not true anymore, the world is in a really dangerous place. And that goes all the way back to who we are from our very beginning as a people. We are the people who connected humanity to God, and the fundamental Jewish understanding is that God is on every level, physically and metaphysically, everything is true, whether it's a law of physics or a moral or ethical principle, ultimately only can come from one source that is not subject to the whims and the changing tides of what human beings think about things, because people are fickle and they change their ideas all the time, and what is acceptable in one century in one
Hmm.
country is unacceptable without an absolute standard, just like we have laws of science that don't change no matter how many times you drop that pen, it's always going to hit the ground.
Right.
We need absolute standards of truth and morality. And that ultimately brings us full circle back to why it is all focusing on us now, because we're the people who brought that into the world. And, if we don't, as Rav Chaim of Volozhin said, when Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. If we don't, as a people, fill the world with the truths and values that have transformed the world and created the most prosperous, stable civilizations in modern history, the world's going to be full of the opposite stuff. The opposite stuff is going to tear all of that down, and it's going to come after us first because it's
Mm,
our responsibility from Abraham onward to be the people who bring that into the world. And if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. And that's the real wake up call. And that's why all people who want to have a stable world need to line up behind the Jewish people to realize what's at stake is truth
mm,
and reality in the future of the world.
right.
We need some
Yeah,
sanity.
it totally. And I think that really just goes, we'll wrap it up here with that idea, which is why I think so many people are feeling so confused with the level of dissonance, where they just keep looking around saying, I don't understand. Like, people are so disconnected from the truth. And it's really challenging and really confusing for people. So I think, we've spoken about this in past episodes where you've said, look, this is a battle of truth, and that the Jewish people, in our own way, we represent a certain type of truth in the world, and Israel is the sort of um, icon for that. That Israel is the Jew of the countries, and has now become the target for all the animus that is generally put against the Jews in each civilization.
True that, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's pray for some clarity and sanity in this world.
Amen. 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 Okay. Thank you so much. This was a super interesting kind of set of pieces to go through, and super helpful to clarify exactly what we're navigating right now, and why it feels so confusing and dissonant. Um, if anybody has questions for us or wants to send topics, please send us an email, send us a note. We would love to hear from you. Please like, share, subscribe. I think there's a YouTube in the works, so we're waiting
We
to
have a
hear.
YouTube channel. Yeah, we're posting the episodes and shorts from the
Awesome.
most.
Amazing. Where can they find that, Ken?
That's on my Ken Spiro YouTube channel. So
Awesome.
if you put,
Okay,
yeah,
cool. All
we'll
right.
have to post that link up.
Yeah, we'll put up that link if you want to check out any of the videos. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As always, thank you, Rebecca Conspiro.
Thanks, Ellie.